Now, let's spend some time in terms of understanding property derivatives. In this session, I'm going to cover what are property derivatives, for what purpose they are typically used, what are the benefits that any investor gets by getting into property derivatives, what are the key risks associated with property derivatives, and out of that, one of the most prominent instrument in the property derivatives today, which is the property swaps. How do I get into the pricing of that? And most of these property derivatives use property indices as the base. So what do we mean by property indices and how are they constructed? And towards the end, a little bit about the tax and the documentation aspects associated with property derivatives. So just to understand, property derivative, again, the underlying here in this case is the property. Think of it like this, right? But of course, here we are not talking about a physical buying or selling of the property in future. So that's the reason they get considered as synthetics. So we are only talking about a cash-based settlement rather than anything involved in terms of physical delivery of the property. And one of the major tools that is working in the property derivatives market today is the property swap. It's a kind of total return swap. So it's like this: two parties A and B getting into a property swap agreement. So one party promises to pay a fixed interest rate, and in return to it, the other party promises to pay the cash flows, the total cash flows on that property. Right? Replicate the financial consequences of a physical property. So when I am talking about replicate the physical consequence, think of it like this. Probably imagine that you are a physical buyer of the property. Now, what are the costs that you are incurring? You are taking a bank loan. Assume in a general case, either you make a lump sum payment or you take a bank loan. And let's look at a simple example of taking a bank loan. So I have taken a mortgage loan, and I keep paying a fixed rate of interest, or in some cases some floating rate. But in majority of the cases, I keep paying fixed rate of interest to the bank. But at the same time, the property belongs to me. So I get all the income and capital that is there on that property. Right? If I rent, I can rent it. I can use it for any source of income. And I can even sell it and create a capital gain out of it. But at the same time, apart from the bank loan, I have to pay for stamp duty, legal fees, agent fees, all other costs that are incurred. So the same logic goes in case of a property swap. So probably assume that A is a property swap buyer. So just like a property buyer, the property swap buyer will benefit from the cash flows of the property. All kinds of cash flow returns based on that particular property. And at the same time, he ends up paying either a fixed rate or a floating rate equal to all the costs. So either it even includes stamp duty, legal tax and all the other costs. Either a fixed rate or a floating rate is what is being paid by this payer at regular intervals. So one party is paying some fixed or floating rate. The other party is paying the total returns that can be possible on the property. So if you look at it from a seller's perspective, he is receiving a fixed rate or a floating rate. So he is reducing his exposure to the property altogether. Though he is the owner of that property still, because he is not physically selling the property. Though he is the owner of the property still, he is reducing his exposure because he is paying whatever the return the property is giving, and he is receiving a fixed rate of interest. So he is reducing the exposure to property, whereas the property buyer or property swap buyer is increasing his exposure to the property. So the property swap seller is receiving a fixed rate, which is majorly for compensating for all kinds of selling costs, running costs, everything are included as a part of that fixed rate. And just like any other swap transaction, there is no upfront exchange of the principal, right? And initially the swap is constructed that the value of the swap is zero for both the parties. No party is at an advantage or a disadvantage. So the valuation becomes very, very important, because the fixed rate is decided purely on the basis of how the property prices are going to fluctuate in future. And in most of the cases, you see that this kind of a deal is constructed based on a property index rather than looking at specific set of properties physically. Now just looking at, now you see, think of a physical property which is owned by X, right? Now he is trying to sell the exposure. He is still owning it. Whatever is the return that this property is giving, he is planning to give it to the other party. Now this party is buying the exposure. Now what you see, this party will pay the total property returns, whereas this party is paying either a fixed rate or a floating rate back here. And this could even involve the physical property costs that are included. Now this is where we are talking about the property swap that is existing between two parties here. So this could be an instrument which is very heavily used, where one party, this party, without owning the property, now if you look at this transaction, he is not owning the property, but he is getting the exposure to the property. He is getting the returns which the property physical owner of the property is getting. Whereas this party is owning the property, but he is still getting a fixed return. He is nowhere having any kind of an exposure to the property. Now that is what is the whole transaction behind the property swap. Now the property swap can even be created into a new instrument called property linked notes. How? Whatever is the cash. So this party, if he has invested the cash, the principal, right, the principal that he would have got if he has, the principal which he would have incurred if he had bought the property physically. That principal, if he is actually putting in a risk-free investment. Now what is happening? He is getting a property return along with, right, if that amount is deposited, is actually getting a physical property return along with a fixed rate of return because he has invested in a government bond. Now this is what is changing the property swap into a property linked notes, because the returns that are coming purely are linked based on the property, and because on one side he would be paying a fixed return, he is receiving the property return plus the fixed return from the government bond. So overall you could see that what he is getting is a property return. So a bond which is more and more virtually linked to the property itself. So the property swap is constructed into a property linked notes, another kind of an instrument, through this kind of a mechanism. Now, why does someone get into a property swap? So here we are always talking about two different things. Either buy property swap or buy property physically. Right? From a buyer standpoint, I want to look at between these two. From a seller standpoint, I want to look at selling a property swap versus selling physical property. What are the differences between the two? First of all, when I look at buyer's perspective, it's a fast and efficient asset allocation because I'm not physically owning anything. So the documentation, lot of other stuff are very, very minimal. So even I can have a divisibility in the units. Even I don't need to own a full-fledged property. Even a part of it can very well be owned. I can diversify using an index. So I don't need to invest in one single property. I could buy the units in each of the different kinds of property swaps. I can get into multiple property swaps using an index. If I'm doing if I'm receiving the return on an index rather than one single property, it's as good as I have diversified across different kinds of properties. And I'm not unable to get an international diversification because I'm able to invest in properties which are across the globe. And new cash, whatever I'm receiving, right, I really don't need to pay for the loan and all because the principal is literally not invested, is not exchanged, which means the time lag in terms of using of that new cash is much lesser. And probably they can very well be bundled with various other derivatives to make it more and more suitable to my needs. So a buyer is very much comfortable in terms of going ahead with property derivative. And from a seller's perspective, yes, if the property prices are going down and down and down, if he sells his property, obviously he is getting nothing out of it. Rather than that, if he is talking about a property swap where he is a seller, he is receiving a fixed return, but at the same time he has to pay the change in the price. So if the change in the price is negative, he has to pay a negative price, means he will only receive even the property return. So he is receiving a fixed return along with the property return. So it's actually a very good hedge, especially in case of falling market. Very advantageous tool if he has got into a property swap, because on one side he will be getting a fixed return, on the other side he has to pay whatever are the returns on the property. Now if the returns on the property are negative from one period to the other, obviously he has to pay negative return, which is as good as he is receiving positive return. So he is getting a double benefit there. So that is why I am saying it's a hedge against the market downturn. He can rebalance the portfolio quite comfortably. If I am physically selling my asset, owning the asset, selling it, there is a liquidity issue, there are so many transaction issues. Now if I have to get out of this portfolio and create another one, or probably sell off one property from my list and include the other one, there is no physical exchange of the stuff, so it becomes quite comfortable. So I can reduce my concentration risk because I am not any of, see, if I have to own one house, it takes quite a good amount of money and it's a concentration risk. But now when I am depending on an index, probably I can diversify to any extent. So again, I can have alpha options and any other tailored solutions on the top of these property derivatives. And I can very well go with longing on the physical property and shorting on the index to create the outperformance altogether as well. So even a seller is quite comfortable in terms of using property derivatives rather than typically going with a physical property. And look at the real physical real estate compared to that. This is a good practice proxy. One, because it's relatively liquid. Whenever I want to get out of the position, I can quite comfortably. There is price transparency because the quotes are rightly available, whereas the real estate prices, they are not directly available anywhere. And even the various costs that are associated with the physical owning, the documentation, the stamp duties, agency costs, all those things are not that heavily incurred as a part of the going with property swaps. Then, if I am going with the traditional forms of property, transactional costs are much higher, brokerage costs are much higher, illiquid, I can't sell it whenever I want, and probably the risk management is the poorest in them. But on the other hand, when I am using property derivatives, things are much better. And ease of entry and exit is much comfortable here. So that is what is making my portfolio management process, risk management process more and more effective when I am relying with property derivatives rather than going ahead with the physical ownership of the property. So what I could see is there are multiple dimensions where the investment in the property derivatives is much more beneficial rather than a physical investment and ownership in the real property. But obviously it has its own set of risks as well. Because on one side we talk about the physical property being the largest asset class, but still the risk management is much poorer there. At least the liquidity concern is addressed very much by the property derivatives. A downturn in the macroeconomic factors and all can be very much addressed by the derivatives. But the basis risk, in some cases, especially the hedged instrument, see if I am looking at the asset to be hedged, which is the exposure to the property, and let's say I am trying to hedge them with the property derivatives. In some cases, it would look like a proper hedging. In some cases, the basis risk could be much more higher, widening the basis in many cases. So, in some cases, it may go in favor, and in some cases, it may go against the investor. But on the other dimensions like cost of dealing, very much lesser, transparency is higher, liquidity is higher. Volatility, if we are looking at, because both of them are based on the same underlying, which is the property, volatility may be more or less similar. But because the derivatives are frequently traded because of the liquidity, probably the indication of the future property returns are much more transparent and reliable compared to the original physical property prices itself. But of course, just like any other over-the-counter transaction, there might be exposed to counterparty credit risk. But what we are saying is the documentation and the various collaterals kind of mechanisms can very well address this counterparty credit risk comfortably. And when it comes to the pricing, you see here the pricing is nothing but determination of that fixed rate. Because on one side, just like an interest rate swap, right? Determination of the fixed rate based on how the floating rates are going to emerge in the future. So here also in a property swap, determination of that fixed rate based on the understanding of how the property prices are going to change in the future. So how the property returns are going to come up. So that's the kind of a forecast that is very much necessary. And that is what will determine your fixed rate, right? And at the same time, apart from the forecasting, even that forecast of the property should also take various factors into consideration. Okay, if the costs are changing, stamp duty is changing, legal fees changing, agent fees is changing. So any kind of changes to the owning of the property, taxes changing, and the interest rates changing drastically. So obviously the value of the property is going to change because interest rate is used as a factor for discounting the future cash flows to the present value. And even the demand and supply for a property in a particular geographic location changing. All these things are definitely going to impact the forecasts of the property prices, and in a way they are going to impact the fixed rate of return in a property swap. And once let's say something is determined, once a fixed rate is determined, again just like any other swap, the valuation happens on a mark to market basis. There is a daily settlement. So on a daily basis, we are trying to find out the cash flows, discounting them, and trying to find out which party is having a positive value and which party has a negative value in the process. As I have already discussed, instead of directly relying on some specific physical property as the base for deciding the return, to a large extent, all these property derivatives are based on property indices. There are some commercial vendors who are typically publishing the property indices based on a set of properties, a big list of properties that are included as a part of that property index. So they are measuring the property returns both for commercial as well as residential. They take care of capital appreciation values, the income generation as well as total returns. They are published on an annual or quarterly or monthly basis. Each of the different vendors provide the data on different kinds of mechanisms. So either their values are based on regular valuations that are being done on the properties or the actual transactions that are happening, buy-sell transactions that are happening on the different properties in different geographies. So they publish the data relating to total return, income return, capital appreciation, the increase in the rental values. All these things can very well be published by them. And some of these indices providers, they are even providing subsectoral. So within the real estate segment, they are looking at the residential separately, commercial separately. Within the residential also, geography wise, they can very well present. So all these kinds of indices are being published for different kinds of regions and asset classes. They are different, publishing the indices separately, which are used as a base in terms of computing the returns and which are becoming the input into the computation of the pricing of the property swap and then the valuation of the property swap. And coming to the tax, exactly like the underlying property, the tax treatment for property derivatives also exists. And typically, because it's a bilateral contract, the ISDA provides the templates and definitions for executing the trades. So a lot of things are included in it. Some of the key things like, what if the property index is delayed? In case the property index is not published on time, how are the cash flows exchanged? If a particular property index is discontinued, now what would be the new base? All these things are discussed quite comfortably as a part of that ISDA master agreement. So just a quick understanding of the property derivatives is essential. We are not getting into the pricing and all these aspects. No numericals are involved. It's only the understanding of the property derivatives which is expected at this particular moment. So we have talked about what are the property derivatives, for what purpose you use them, and what are the advantages, what are the inherent risks that are associated with property and property derivatives, how do I price property swaps, what are property indices, and finally looking at the basics of tax and documentation issues associated with the property swaps. So that's it that I wanted to cover as a part of this session. Thank you.